Now today I'm going to talk about Martin Luther King, which is, I'm sure, a figure that everyone's heard of, and they have a sense of who he was and what he stood for and what he fought for. And much of what you think about King is no doubt true. Sorry. And what I want to talk about really is how the popular image of King and the popular understanding of King is actually really very limited in lots of ways. I'll explain why that is, how it is, and how we have really a very sanitized vision and version of what Martin Luther King stood for, and that sanitized version has very real political uses in America today. It's an image that's been manipulated by people, those on the right presumably, who are really set against pushing back against gains made by the civil rights movement during the 1960s and 70s, and really to try and dictate the terms on which the conversation about race relations in the US happens today. Indeed, many have used a particular image of King and the civil rights movement to suggest that America is a post-racial society. That is to say, it is a society that has left race and racism behind. A society in which racism no longer exists. Of course, that seems less plausible to argue in light of recent events. But I also realise that a lot of you won't necessarily know a great deal about the civil rights movement. So I suppose my broader point here is to demonstrate or try and explain or give an example of why the ways that we understand the past, the stories we tell about the past, are still important. The past is always being used by people in the present to try and justify some state of affairs or to argue for the existence of some other state of affairs, or to push for some kind of change. So that's a very long-winded way of saying what Orwell says in 1984, which is who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. In the case of the United States, how people understand the nation's racial past is still vitally important to today. We can look at the last 5 years of tremendous activity in the United States from Ferguson onwards. The development of Black Lives Matter campaign, this is a real current issue in the United States today. Police violence, of course, against African Americans being the most obvious example. So race is still a central, perhaps the central issue for understanding American life and politics today. And so the stories we tell about the civil rights movement are tremendously important. And King is, of course, the central figure when we think of that civil rights movement. He is the central figure in popular understandings of it. He's the first person that most people would think of when you say the civil rights movement, and why that is one of the things I want to talk about today. So I don't normally put so much text on my slides, but I thought I would today just to try and set things out clearly. And this is what I'm going to go through. So I'm going to talk initially about that image that we do have of King today, but it's going to be a lecture of two halves, because in the first half talking about King, King and what's called the master narrative of the civil rights movement, which I'll say more about. And then this section here on King the Radical, which is a part of King's life that many people simply don't know about, which is the last few years of his life, when he really becomes quite radical in his political and economic philosophies. And then the final, really second half, is going to look at this question of colourblind conservatism. On colourblind conservatives in the US who've used a very limited view of King's life over the last 3 or 4 decades to push back against racial change and to argue that America is a post-racial society. Okay, so let's start with King today, and I think it's safe to say that King is ubiquitous in the United States. So there are dozens and dozens of schools named after him, there are dozens and dozens of streets named after him. You can see a few of them here. Martin Luther King Elementary, Martin Luther King High, Martin Luther King Boulevard, so on and so forth. And in 1986, Congress made Martin Luther King, or named a federal holiday after him. So there is a Martin Luther King Day, so January 15th of every year, a federal holiday, a day in which he can be commemorated, he can be celebrated, and it's often used as a cipher for discussing contemporary race relations in the US. But it's a day in which you're meant to celebrate the man and his ideas. And I think the simple act of naming roads and naming schools after someone may seem, I guess, innocent enough, but it's tremendously important. It has real political meaning. And this is kind of the point I'm going to make today, because it's helped to cement Martin Luther King into the cultural landscape of the United States, kind of irrevocably. You won't be able to erase Martin Luther King from America's history or its present day cultural landscape, because he's essentially become a national saint in many ways. And that's something made clear when they recently unveiled the monument of King on the National Mall. Excuse me. So this is was opened October 16th rather, 2011, so less than 5 years ago. It's the newest addition to the National Mall in Washington. It sits between the Jefferson Memorial, so one of the founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, and the Lincoln Memorial. At the other end, it's 30 foot high, it's granite, and it's the tallest statue on the National Mall. It's 10 feet taller than Lincoln's statue, which is itself is a statement. You know, your biggest, most impressive statue on the National Mall is of Martin Luther King. But why? Why all this commemoration of King? I had a student last year who's an American student who was at UC Santa Barbara, came over to Sussex for a term, and he took a course I teach called African American Experience. And you know, where he lives, he grew up not far from Martin Luther King Street, from where he grew up, and he said he never thought about why it was that the street was named after Martin Luther King. But by the end of the module, that's the kind of thing that we're trying to make clear, that these things do have a deliberate purpose. They are meant to put Martin Luther King at the centre of American cultural life. So it's him on the National Mall for a reason, it's his name on these schools and on these road signs for a reason. And the image that Americans have generally of Martin Luther King, and I think people more broadly, is one that's been very selectively sculpted, and it's been used by people today to champion ideas that King himself would have utterly rejected, were he still alive. Excuse me, I'm just coming down with a cough at the absolute worst time to be doing that. But the popular rendering we have of King then is of a moderate. So he's meant to be a moderate man. He was a centrist civil rights leader. He's the apostle of non-violence. He's a Christian minister, a man of the cloth, who was ultimately committed to colour blindness. Now that is the King that we remember. And this is the King we get from what's known as the master narrative of the civil rights movement. And what I mean by that is essentially the popular understanding of the civil rights movement. So historian Brian Moore put it nicely, I think. He said the master narrative of the civil rights movement is essentially, quotes, a conventional layperson's sense of what the civil rights movement was and what it was about. So if you were to ask anyone on the street, what do you think the civil rights movement was about? The kind of master narrative is the kind of thing they're likely to tell you back. So it's the kind of narrative that's spun through schools, history lessons at school, through television programs, newspapers, the media more generally, museums, commemoration events like Martin Luther King or Black History Month. There are many ways that these kind of messages and stories are transmitted to the public. Now, to think about this master narrative of the civil rights movement more generally, one question that we have to think about is periodization of the civil rights movement. That is to say, how long was the civil rights movement? When did it begin? When did it end? And I think historians would argue, well, there's still debate over it, but broadly speaking, we should say it kind of begins just after the Second World War and it ends towards the end of the 1960s. But what we get in the master narrative is really a much shorter vision of what the civil rights movement was. It's what's also known as the classical phase that begins with the Brown versus Board of Education decision in May '54 and it ends just over a decade later with the passage of the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of '64 just before it. And what you get in this master narrative is a kind of national civil rights coalition led by these groups. So the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, that was King's organisation, the NAACP, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and the Congress on Racial Equality, or CORE. And they were apparently committed to destroying segregation and winning the vote for African Americans in the South. And they wanted to try and at least begin the task of closing the material gap between black and white Americans. And they used a combination of legal action, traditional lobbying, and peaceful street protest. So this is a short civil rights movement we get from the master narrative, and these are the kind of classic events that we get that are routinely trotted out as being this is how we understand the civil rights movement. So you have Brown, but lots of other famous moments. Montgomery bus boycott, where Rosa Parks, of course, is arrested. A Little Rock Schools crisis, the sit-ins, freedom rides, and then iconic a demonstration campaign for burning of Selma, in between which we have the March on Washington as well. So if you took this perspective of the civil rights movement, it's really southern-based. It's focused on non-violent direct action, and it's one that's really seemed to be trying to redeem the soul of America by opening the eyes of the nation at large to the evils of racism and segregation. And it's a movement, though, although it was critical at times of America, was often very patriotic in tone, and it grounded its claims to equal citizenship in a positive identification with the American supposedly democratic heritage and creed, this kind of political tradition, American protest. So it's a movement that, at least on the surface, was committed or held to the idea that America was innately a moral nation that could be convinced that segregation and racism was wrong. And that America could therefore have its moral conscience moved by the civil rights movement and be roused to action, and they would remove the stain of Jim Crow segregation from their law books. And then in this kind of history, you get the Civil Rights Act in '64, the Voting Rights Act in '65. So America does act. White America sees injustice and it acts to rid the nation of that injustice. So the white America's eyes are opened, and the story suggests America is a moral nation that did what it had to do to deal with injustice. Which is a very comforting story, I'm sure you'll agree. It's a story that venerates the African American protesters, and it tells a story of kind of pleasing moral rectitude on the part of white Americans, at least those beyond the South. And so, just to underline, it's one that really implies racism was only a Southern problem, and not a national problem, which many people would say it certainly was. And it rests on the assumption also that racism was a moral problem, rather than being a problem of deeply embedded institutional discrimination and institutional behaviour and private attitudes across the country. And it's King who's absolutely at the heart of this vision of what the civil rights movement is. And for many reasons, and this is a series of books, actually very good books in most cases, that were written in the late 80s and early 90s, all of which are basically telling the story of the civil rights movement through the life of Martin Luther King. So they really did help to cement the idea that the story of King's life was the story of the civil rights movement. And there's lots of issues here that historians have pushed back against. How can you tell the story of a whole movement through the life of one man? But this is tremendously important because this underlines the idea that King is basically the civil rights movement. Okay, and so the King that we get, who stands tallest in this master of civil rights narrative, is, as I said, kind of moderate, centrist leader, this apostle of non-violence. He's very much committed to colourblindness, to Christian brotherhood, to integration, to racial harmony. And in many ways, this King kind of frozen in time on the steps of the National Mall at the March of Washington, when he gives his famous "I Had a Dream" speech. Now I'm sure everyone knows at least those words from the speech, and possibly only those words. And this is because those are the words that are most important in terms of shaping the image that King has that's so politically useful today. So here's that kind of famous excerpt that's taken out. And I've used these internet memes because it's revealing that when you type in Martin Luther King into Google Images, dozens and dozens of images like this come up. His face with that quote next to it, which is kind of what I'm talking about here today. When people think of King today, these are the words they think about first and foremost, the ones they most readily associate with him. So it's understood to be his message, to be what he stood for. And this is the King that enjoys widespread acceptability in American public discourse. Excuse me. So what is that message? Well, as you can see, I have a dream that my 4 children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. So it's a meritocratic future America where race is no longer considered a factor in people's thinking, or indeed in life more generally, when consideration of skin colour rather is a thing of the past. And so with King presented as a defining figure in this master narrative of the civil rights movement, this vision of a colourblind future is also being presented or has been kind of interpreted as being the vision and aim of the civil rights movement as a whole. King's dream is the dream of the movement as a whole. Now this is all very important. The reason I labour this point is because it's important for what I'm going to say later about how conservatives in the United States today have used this highly limited vision of King and the civil rights movement. So hold on to this idea, if you will, so we'll return to it later on. But before I get on to thinking about how conservatives use today, I want to kind of give you an illustration of how limited the vision of King is that we have, or at least from that master narrative that I've talked about. And how much of this image of King is kind of distorts, suppresses, and misses out important parts of his life, especially the last few years of his life. So from kind of late 1965 through to his tragic murder in April 1968. Now, it's a part of King's life that's almost entirely missing from that narrative, master narrative I've talked about. Obviously, it comes after the Voting Rights Act has been passed. And it's a period when he does become increasingly radical in his thinking and in his outlook, and in the message that he's articulating in the last years of his life. Indeed, during those 3 years, he develops into a kind of ardent democratic socialist, and this is kind of basically, I say, late 65, early 66 onwards. There's tremendously destructive rioting in south central Los Angeles, a place called Watts, in August 65, less than a week after the Voting Rights Act has been signed into law. And this really shocks the nation. No one can understand how we've just had the Voting Rights Act passed, how can we have urban rioting just a week later? And the problem was that the Voting Rights Act could help African Americans in the South, but it wasn't going to help African Americans in the ghettos of the urban West, North, Midwest, so on and so forth, because they could already vote. They didn't face Jim Crow segregation like African Americans in the Deep South did. They were poor, but there were no laws that could be passed that could stop them being poor. And it's in the wake of Watts that King realises that he and other civil rights leaders haven't done much to help African Americans in those kind of poor black inner city communities. So he begins to turn away from the South and to what he thinks is the new battleground for racial equality. It's going to be in the ghettos of the urban North, Midwest and West. And in January 66 he goes up to Chicago, and he's absolutely stunned at the response he receives from local white communities. The virulent racist hostility kind of knocks him off his feet. He's confronted by neo-Nazis, by other white supremacist groups, people dressed like the Ku Klux Klan. He has onlookers throw bottles and bricks at him as he's marching alongside other blacks. And they're marching for open housing against housing discrimination in the city. And again, this kind of image actually is a good one to use to illustrate the point about the master narrative. This is not an image you would get associated with the civil rights movement for two reasons. One, it's after legislation has been passed, so the master narrative assumes and implies that racism was kind of dealt with once we passed the Civil and Voting Rights Act. And also it's in Chicago. It's not in Mississippi, where you might more readily expect this kind of display of white supremacy and hostility. This suggests that racism wasn't just a southern problem. It makes clear that it was a national problem in many ways. But as King's exposed to this kind of hatred in the North amongst whites, and the more he comes to see the problems of urban African Americans in places like Chicago, he sees that the civil rights movement had really done very little to help those people. And so he starts looking for ways to deal with the problems that they face. And they face more insidious forms of discrimination that help keep them trapped in poverty and urban squalor. So he becomes increasingly radical in his thinking, and he begins to identify the structures of American society as being fundamentally corrupt and in need of transformation. So this is a great quote from 67. I beg your pardon. And this really kind of exemplifies the kind of message he begins to give. So the Black Revolution is much more than the struggle for the right of the Negroes. It is forcing America to face all its interrelated flaws: racism, poverty, militarism, and materialism. It is exposing evils that are deeply rooted in the whole structure of our society and suggests the radical reconstruction of that society is the real issue to be faced. Now think about that as a change from 4 years earlier. Racism isn't a moral problem anymore. You can't change people's minds to rid America of racism. You need to fundamentally transform American society and its institutions. And these are not the words of a man who can be a national saint. You can't have a national saint say this about your society. It doesn't really fit with how King is understood today then by most people. You also had King speak out against the war in Vietnam, and more generally American military imperialism abroad, when he says in a very famous quote on a speech he gives on April 4th in 1967 at the Riverside Church in New York, that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. Which is a very strong thing to say about your nation. And actually this precipitates a break with President Johnson, who he worked with for a long time on civil rights reform. He never goes back to the White House ever again after he makes his speech on Vietnam. He's blocked out. He's essentially cast aside. Johnson never speaks to him again, basically. Because what King does is he links the violence against the Vietnamese with domestic racism. He's saying you can't separate the oppression of African Americans at home with the murder of Vietnamese peasantry overseas. And so think again of the difference from a man sitting in front of the Lincoln statue 4 years earlier at the March on Washington, where he talked about this dream of a colourblind future. It's a very different King. But this kind of message, and the one I showed you before, really is very typical of the kind of thing he's saying throughout 67 and into 68 as well. And in many ways, he was far closer to the political message being offered by Black Power radicals, including people like the Black Panther Party, at this stage of his life, though he was always committed to non-violence as a way of life. But it was a message that was highly critical of America, society in general, its institutions, and it identified racism as being at the core of American life. And it was a message that rested on the belief that moral suasion wouldn't work. You couldn't convince America to change its heart because America was at root fundamentally immoral. At least this is what King is saying now. Very different to the message he gave in the early 60s. You can't change hearts and minds. You need to transform capitalism. You need to change, which was at the heart of American institutions. You need to start again with all these institutions. And just as importantly, one thing he does call for here at this point, because he also leads something called a Poor People's Campaign, where he tries to get essentially interracial groups of the poor, so lots of white poor, lots of African Americans, Latinos, Puerto Ricans, Hispanics, from across the country, together to lobby for kind of a change in politics. He wants a massive redistribution of wealth and power from the top down to the bottom. So this is the democratic socialist King that comes increasingly into the fore from 66 onwards. And it's no accident that when King is killed in Memphis, Tennessee, he's there supporting a strike by sanitation workers for better pay, for better conditions. He's there supporting economic justice. And that's a very dangerous message to be giving in the United States, both then and now. But as I say, this King, this vision of King, this radical King, this social democrat who wants a redistribution of power from the top to the bottom, simply doesn't fit into the mass narrative of the civil rights movement. It doesn't fit with what he is seen to be about. It doesn't fit with that image of him as national saint today. There's no room for this radical King. Because, as I said, you can't have a national saint and be so critical of your nation. And so the overwhelmingly dominant image, the politically safe and also very useful image of King, is of him on the mall in Washington in August 63, talking about his dream and a future of interracial harmony. And hopefully what I've said is clear. I hope it resonates with you. I like to think it would resonate with you to think about just how powerful an image or association people have with King, with this kind of colourblind dream, and not so much with this kind of excoriation of the United States and its political system. Okay, so that's the image of King that we have, and how and the kind of things that it misses out, which I think are important. And I want to turn now to explaining why the sanitised popular image of King that I've talked about, and this master narrative more generally, how they've been harnessed by conservatives in America today over the last few decades. I'm going to say in relation to two things in particular. Okay, so one is that they use it in opposition to so-called race-conscious policies such as affirmative action and busing. And also, it's used as a way to explain ongoing racial inequality in the United States today, and especially the economic dimension. So, essentially, why are African Americans still poor in disproportionately large numbers? So these are the two things I'm going to think about. We'll start then with opposition to race-conscious policies. Now, one of the consequences of the civil rights movement's apparent success, or successes in the mid-60s, was that it forced those who opposed the civil rights movement to reframe their opposition. They had to reinvent themselves. They did this in the 1970s when the conservative movement begins to reject a kind of old-fashioned racism and begins to embrace an idea of formal equality. And in the process, they latch on to that master narrative of the civil rights movement. They help to build that master narrative of the civil rights movement. And they rework it for their own purposes and begin to articulate what's known as colourblind conservatism. So these colourblind conservatives essentially ignore the complexity of and the dynamism of the civil rights movement. They ignore its growing focus on structural and economic inequality and its more radical goals like economic justice. Again, hence they had no time for this, the radical king of his later years, who was talking out about the interrelatedness of capitalism, poverty and racism. Instead, these conservatives essentially said that colourblindness, defined basically as the elimination of racial classifications and the establishment of formal equality before the law, were the movement's singular objective, and King is used as the man to make this clear. This is the principle, the sole principle which King stood, they say. He stood for colourblindness. So, again, you can see why the March on Washington that speech is so important, because that's his colourblind credentials set down. So these conservatives, they admitted that racism had existed in the past, but they said that racism was just individual bigotry. It wasn't an institutional or structural dimension of American life. They said it did exist, but it existed in the South, and really only in the South. It wasn't a national problem. Which is why they needed a civil rights narrative that says civil rights was a southern issue. Racism wasn't a national problem. It was restricted to the South. So part of the narrative that these conservatives spin is that when you have the passage of civil rights legislation in '64, the Civil Rights Act in particular, racism begins to diminish into insignificance. And here's a brief kind of précis of the Act itself. So the '64 Civil Rights Act ends segregation in public places in the United States, and it bans employment discrimination on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin. So conservatives hold this up and they say this piece of legislation has essentially now made American institutions free and fair. We've got rid of discrimination from our law books. American society is now open and fair and free to all. So a chief target of their opposition then have been these so-called race-conscious policies. And I mentioned affirmative action and busing as two of the most famous that are devised in the late 60s, early 70s. And these have become the objects of great conservative hostility. So I don't know how many people have heard of affirmative action or busing, but I'll say a little bit about them. So affirmative action is essentially a policy that is based on taking positive steps to increase the number of African Americans and other minorities or marginalised groups in employment and higher education. And this policy really reaches its zenith in the late 1960s and 1970s under President Richard Nixon. He installs it alongside federal support for minority businesses as pretty much the primary way the federal government tries to help African Americans. Now, both civil rights and black power activists were right behind affirmative action. They thought it was a good thing because they wanted a proactive policy, not one that said, we're past this law now, no one's going to discriminate against you anymore, but actually, how do you correct historical injustice? If you have a town, if you have a factory with 100 people working in it, and discrimination has meant only 10 of the applications, or 10 of those jobs rather, have gone to African Americans, it's all very well saying, now you don't have to discriminate, but you've still got 90% of the jobs going to whites. How do you catch up essentially, on past discrimination. How can you, I guess, fast forward for African Americans to make equality a fact now, not a future promise? So they were absolutely behind federal commitment to affirmative action and pushed it as much as they could. And other groups were very much in support of affirmative action too. The American women's movement being a perfect example. So women absolutely latched onto affirmative action and used it to try and advance the fight for gender equality in the workplace too, for exactly the same reasons. And President Nixon does take affirmative action quite far. He endorses the setting of goals and timetables to try and overturn historical employment bias. So this made progress towards having a more diverse workforce, something that we could measure and monitor. So Conservatives oppose this for many, many reasons, which I can go into in the questions if you'd like, but for the purposes of this discussion here, their main objection to affirmative action was, they said, that it was a blatant violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because it undermined the very anti-discrimination statutes that the Civil Rights Act has set down and tried to make a reality. Sorry, okay. And it's a very similar story for busing. So busing, for those of you who have not heard it before, is essentially a practice that federal courts who are adjudicating school desegregation cases would order school districts to do in order to achieve racial balance in American schools. So they would say, the idea was they were trying to make America's school systems, public school systems, more racially integrated. So if you have a white neighborhood with an all-white school, a black neighborhood with an all-black school, you would take children from both and you bus them to the opposite school, so you would have a degree of racial mixture in each school. Now, this encountered tremendous hostility from white Americans, especially lower middle and working class white parents, and it became a really kind of central plank of conservative politics in the late 60s and especially the 1970s. And in both these cases, what conservatives argue is that the fundamental contradiction between the civil rights movement's apparent vision of a colourblind society and these race-conscious policies. That is to say, if you seek to eradicate discrimination through positive action towards hiring minority workers or busing children to achieve racial balance in schools, both affirmative action and busing explicitly required race to be taken into consideration and made a decisive factor in the decision-making process. So that's the kind of paradox, if you will, of these race-conscious policies. Affirmative action and busing require race to be a factor that you have to consider, and yet the Civil Rights Act 64 says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, you cannot use race as a factor when making those choices. Which is kind of bind the civil rights movement finds itself in, which is why conservatives can use this idea of a colourblind civil rights movement to push back against these kind of policies. And one of the reasons they're pushing back against the policies is because they argue that they're fundamentally unfair to white people. That it's not fair to white people. If you've got a business manager who says, well, I've got to try and hire some African Americans, I've got to try and hire some women, then white male politicians are thinking, what about white men? What about their jobs? You know, it's not fair on them. They might be more qualified, they might be a better candidate, but you might pick the African American candidate because you feel you have to because of affirmative action. And these were the kind of things that were said ad nauseum at the time and since. So this is kind of the ideological bedrock of colourblind conservatism. What they're saying is race-conscious policies keep race alive as a factor in American political life, and that's exactly what the civil rights movement and Martin Luther King didn't want. So to follow these policies, you're essentially turning back on the civil rights movement, you're dishonouring its memory, and you're undoing all its good work. And of course it's that very sanitised vision of the civil rights movement, the King in particular. So again, there's no room for the radical King. There's no room for the King who speaks out in Vietnam, criticises American poverty and racism. We need the King who speaks of the dream where his children will be judged not by the colour of their skin, but by the content of their character. And so in vehemently opposing race-conscious policies like affirmative action and busing, conservatives in America will present themselves in some cases as being the true protectors of the civil rights movement's legacy, which is quite the perverse act. because of course they're absolutely not committed to racial equality in most cases at all. But this narrative that colourblind conservatives have put forward has a very wide appeal, especially of course amongst white Americans. It kind of conforms to white middle class values, it flatters national vanities, and of course it resonates with ideas of individual effort and merit, these kind of widely shared values that many people believe to be kind of core American ideas. Self-reliance. You wouldn't need affirmative action if you were self-reliant. So goes the criticism. And since the late 60s, this kind of rhetoric of colourblind conservatism has really become important centrally to American policy making. It's become absolutely entrenched, which means it's much harder to ever try and pursue policies that seek to deal with historic injustice, to try and redress the balance, because they've lost political legitimacy in many cases. Because we have had 3 to 4 decades of conservative control in Washington, pretty much since the 1970s. And so this leads me on to kind of final and kind of major point that I want to make, which is about how that mass narrative of the civil rights movement and the sanitised limited vision of King that it gives us has been used to explain ongoing racial inequality in the US today. And I think if we're going to think about the way that King's image and message is used to explain racial inequality, then we should obviously say something about the dimensions of racial inequality today. So what then is the current state of Black America? Well, it's clear today that along with Native Americans, African Americans are at the absolute foot of the American socio-economic order. In 2007, median black income was 59% that of white Americans. And at the bottom of the income distribution, the disparities are even greater on racial lines. You're more than twice as likely to be poor if you're black than you are if you're white. Black wealth is a minuscule fraction that of whites. The median net worth of the average white family is 15 times higher than it is for the average black family. The rate of unemployment amongst African Americans is 1.5 times greater than it is amongst whites. And residential segregation is the norm for African Americans. So 2/3 of African Americans live in neighbourhoods that are deemed to be segregated by race. And it's very clear that segregated living, or neighbourhoods rather, adversely affect wealth generation, job opportunities, and other economic opportunities available to the residents of those communities. 75% of the residents of the nation's worst pockets of poverty in America are either black or Latino. And although African Americans represented just 13% of its population in 2008 with the subprime mortgage crisis, they held over half, over 50% of subprime mortgages were held by African Americans, despite being only 13% of the population. And that, obviously that meant they were grossly disproportionately affected by the credit crunch, the recession, and the repossession of homes that happened in late 2008. But that itself is a direct legacy of racially discriminatory housing and credit policies stretching back all the way to the 1930s. And we can also look at the staggering rate of incarceration amongst African Americans. And it's worth saying actually that incarceration rates in America are sky high anyway. In 2007, 1 out of every 100 American adults was in prison, which is astronomically high even by global standards. But for African Americans, the rate was far, far worse. So 1 in 9 black men between the ages of 20 and 34 were in prison. 1 out of every 15 adult black males, and 1 out of every 100 black women were in prison as well. And for white women, for example, it's 1 out of every 335. So tremendously high figures of incarceration for African Americans. And just to give you a sense, here in the UK, our rates of incarceration are about 20% of what they are in the United States. So it's off the scale, as it were, in the United States. Excuse me. There's also a very clear, unmistakable intersection between race and health issues. So There's a grossly disproportionate number, or incidence rather, of respiratory diseases and of AIDS infection amongst African Americans. Blacks, on average, die much earlier than whites as well. And there's pronouncedly higher rate of infant mortality amongst African Americans too. So these are the kind of terms of inequality. It's not just financial, it affects almost every single dimension you care to choose. But how then do we, or how is this inequality, how are these inequalities explained in the United States today? Well, most African Americans would of course argue that racism has persisted and continues to dominate American life, limiting their options in terms of access to quality education, economic opportunity, and playing a great role in helping to challenge poverty. And some white Americans agree with that as well. There are those progressive, socially democratic Americans, many of whom I guess are campaigning for Bernie Sanders at the moment, who would agree with that as an analysis of racial inequality. But that's not the most dominant or pervasive analysis in the US. The most dominant analysis in the US is one that's been fashioned by conservatives over the last 40, 50 years, and it's one that has absolutely appropriated the language of the Civil Rights Movement and of Martin Luther King, and this Martyr narrative to reject the idea that black poverty has anything to do with institutional racism, and to insist that African American equality is down to African Americans. So just to reiterate how this relates to the Civil Rights Movement and Martin Luther King, let's just briefly return to the Civil Rights Act. And remember, the conservatives say that when this act was passed, America's society and its institutions became fair. Essentially, we ended racism. Racial discrimination became a thing of the past. Now, if you believe that, then from that moment forward, African Americans were just competing in the economy like everyone else. And they were in an economy driven by race-neutral market forces. Market can't be racist, the market's a market. So from that point forward, African Americans, conservatives would say, are responsible for their own success or their own failure. So African Americans remain disproportionately poor. They argued it's about black attitudes or black behaviour, black family structures. Those are the things that are to blame, not, crucially, American society or its political and economic institutions. So this idea of American conservatives rests on the idea that America is now a post-racial society. And the master narrative of the Civil Rights Movement has been harnessed by conservatives to bolster this idea. So maybe it's just worth underlining what I mean when I say post-racial. You can see here essentially the notion that American society has moved beyond race as an issue of genuine meaning or importance. So America has essentially left race and racism behind. And this is a kind of idea that's actually very aggressively put forward, very aggressively articulated by many on the right who are very well funded. And it goes from think tanks, it goes from conservative institutes, and it goes through radio hosts, and goes through Fox News and newspapers, and on to the general public from there. So I can give you a good example. It's one of the earliest examples that's been built on substantially over the last 2 decades, but there's a book by a guy called Dinesh D'Souza. He used to be an advisor to President Reagan in the 80s. And in 1995, he published a book called The End of Racism. And it's basically a polemic about the then state of black-white relations in the US. And obviously enough, his argument in brief was that, generally speaking, African Americans were doing badly because of their own apparent failures, their own moral and cultural failings, rather than the persistence of racism. And he did say that there was some discrimination against African Americans, but that it did not reflect irrational prejudice, but was in fact justified. So he gives lots of examples in the book, and this is, I think, quite a good one for understanding how he speaks about it. So he says, he talks about what he calls rational discrimination. When he says, so take a cab driver who makes a decision not to stop to pick up an African American man as a passenger. D'Souza says that action is a result of a prudential calculation on that driver's part that he has a danger of being robbed or killed by the African American man. And similarly, the difficulty that African Americans have getting loans or mortgages reflects not racism, but the real risks that they face how they represent to lenders. So what he says basically is that racial stereotypes contain a lot of truth, and that people can't be condemned for acting on them, which might seem like a very nice, convenient get-out for those Americans who are very happy to cling on to kind of racist ideas and attitudes. Now, of course, D'Souza was against affirmative action. He called for social outcomes produced by merit alone, not a million miles away from King's language. But again, it's the idea that black inequality is the result not of past and ongoing institutional discrimination, because that is rejected as an idea altogether. And so what he says is America now in 1995 is a post-racist nation. Policies based on the assumption that racial prejudice and discrimination are responsible for the condition of African Americans do more harm than good. So it's not just that African Americans are to blame for their own problems, but policies designed to help them will only make their problems worse. But this is the kind of thing that conservatives have consistently trotted out over the last several decades. And D'Souza has paid a lot of money to write these books. He's supported very well by conservative think tanks and foundations, many of which, of course, backed by big business. And since that book, lots of others have been written. It's helped to really, as I say, entrench that idea of how you explain racial inequality in the United States today. American liberals and moderates have tried to push back against it, but they haven't done a very good job, essentially. So it's very pervasive. I think when you see the opposition to Obamacare in the United States, a lot of it's on the racial grounds that this is going to help black people, even though it's helping more white people. And it's black people, it's seen that if you're dealing with poverty, you're supposed to be dealing with African Americans, and they've been given enough help already. At least this is the kind of narrative that's spun. And of course, there's a very strong voice, a conservative voice in the American media. So this kind of argument, this view of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement, again, this master narrative that I've talked about, they're fundamental in the way that conservatives explain racial inequality today. So, just to reiterate, you might very basically cast it as this. If Martin Luther King stood for a colourblind future, and the 1964 Civil Rights Act made that possible, then the Civil Rights Act movement succeeded and cured America of racism. So if African Americans are disproportionately poor, or make up a disproportionate number of the prison population, they say it's the result of cultural deficiencies in the black community. American society was made free, fair and equal to all by the Civil Rights Act, and so legislation to correct ongoing racial and economic inequality and injustice is not only unnecessary, they argue, but is in fact a betrayal of the civil rights movement's dream. It's antithetical to what King would have wanted. So it is presented as if you are essentially betraying Martin Luther King's memory if you seek to deal with ongoing racial injustice in the United States today. So that's where I'm going to finish. I hope I'll be able to show, at least to a degree, how and why conservatives have used this kind of master narrative of the civil rights movement, which, as I say, does so much to freeze Martin Luther King in time on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in August '63, talking about the future of Christian brotherhood and colourblind racial harmony, and which has entirely blocked out the King, who spoke out against militarism, against racism, against poverty, and it's being used to continue explaining and indeed deepening racial inequality in the US, and to really stymie the efforts of people like Obama to try and pursue policies that might deal with inequality and racial injustice in the US. So, thank you. If you have any questions, I'd be...
You mentioned Obama right at the end, and I've been wondering over the last 10 minutes or so what difference it has made to African Americans to have had an African American president, and has he done anything to move this on?
Good question. Beyond the symbolic victory, seeing an African American in the White House, he's not been able to do a great deal. Obamacare is a very significant achievement, but even that had the kind of heart of it not ripped out, but it was certainly made far less effective than it might otherwise have been by Congress in the way in which it went through Congress. But I think also, and I say this whenever someone asks me about, what do you think of Obama, ultimately we have a very, I think, imbalanced view of him. He's not a warrior for social justice. He's really actually quite a conservative politician himself. I think he's done pretty well considering the difficulties he's faced, but he's never really been an aggressive champion for African American interests. Partly because he couldn't be, because you don't get elected as an African American to the highest office in the land if you're campaigning only on the interests of black people. You have to be a candidate who speaks to white interests and, or at least not just black interests. They can be a very toxic thing. In the case of, say, the Republican Party, of course, who don't even bother trying to ask for black votes. It's just white votes that they're interested in.
In relation to that, is there a possibility, not least in light of the kind of anger that seems to exist in America in the whole run-up to the presidential campaign, and the emergence of Trump in this equation, that actually having a black president has made the situation worse, has increased this, if it's right to call it an unconscious racism amongst the American people? Do you think it has exacerbated the situation?
I think it's been fairly incredible, really, to see the extent to which the opposition to him has been overtly racist. I mean, undeniably so. And some of the, even the earliest days of him being elected, you had Republican Party officials in places like Orange County sending around racist cartoons of the president. And these are political officials for one of the two major parties, not your average kind of racist on the street corner, as it were. I think we have to think that basic racism has never gone, but we didn't realise just how close to the surface it was. I don't know if that's me or not, but we didn't realise just how close to the surface it was in the US. It's been quite remarkable, and the Tea Party, of course, is a perfect example. The personal attacks on Obama, I find it very hard to believe that he would have been attacked and treated the way he has been treated if he had been a white candidate following the same platform. So,
can I just establish, because I can't hear terribly well, but not least in light of what's been happening with forces of law and order in the streets of various towns in America, are both political parties and people in general really believing that there is no racial inequality, that there is no institutional racism in America? Is this a genuine belief?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, lots of white people believe it's the fault of African Americans. And you think about the classic line that they trot out as well. Slavery ended 300 years ago, so 250 years ago. Why aren't African Americans any further forward now than they were then? That there's no link drawn between historical injustice and present inequality. Because often, and it's a very popular way of looking at it amongst many kind of white ethnic Americans, is that, well, my parents came to this country, or my grandparents came to this country with nothing, they worked their way up, they worked hard, they didn't protest, they didn't do X, they didn't do Y, and they made a way in America. Now, of course, that completely ignores the fact that even the Irish are discriminated against terribly in America. We're still never discriminated against as much as African Americans were. They still weren't denied the opportunities that African Americans were. So much of the Irish had to fight for everything they got and did a remarkable job and have done a remarkable job. You can't just, people skip over the fact that race is really still vitally important in explaining that inequality, and racism and its legacy is vitally important. Partly because people don't see that they have, the attitude is, why should the government be run at the expense of African Americans? What about me, essentially? I didn't. I was never a slave owner. I had no hand in black inequality. I wasn't alive in the past to racially oppress African Americans, so why should I suffer now? is another kind of trope of discussion. So I think, of course, there are people who appreciate these things, and you realise that there is a historical legacy to racial discrimination, to segregation, to even all the way back to slavery. You can trace a lot of the roots of these problems. But to explain inequality on racial lines today, you can get all the way back to slavery. But plenty of Americans are not interested in that kind of analysis, and they're more comfortable believing that exactly as I said there. That's the dominant analysis. But it's not just African Americans. Why do you have such huge homeless communities in America? It's because people think, no, it's not something that society should be doing. The homeless are homeless for a reason. It's because there was a problem with them. Not because they might have had some other issue that they needed help with. And if you live in a culture or a society where you have that kind of approach to people who are in need or people who have suffered, then it's very easy to have a more kind of callous view of these things. And inequality is just someone else's problem, not your problem. And it shouldn't be your tax dollars that get spent on correcting it.
Thank you.
Tom, I was thinking if we could compare quotes from what you have up there with the 63 to 64 stuff before the Civil Rights Act and the voting rights, and then after that. And the one that always sticks in my mind is the very famous one where he says, in America we have rugged individualism for the poor and socialism for the rich. And this is very much out of step with, like you said, with the racists, and it's kind of post-reform, 64, 65, towards the end of his life. So I was wondering if you could kind of expand on the idea, is this a transformation, or is it disillusion? And was he always hidden, had he always kind of harbored those kind of beliefs and sentiments? Yeah. Or did he become disillusioned after the kind of very vanilla outcome of 64 to 65?
Yeah, that's a good question. Ultimately, he'd always been, and he was saying, more socialist in his economic thinking than capitalist. So, there's a lot of, especially in the Deep South in the late 50s, and early, once he becomes the fore, the Montgomery bus boycott, and especially in the 60s, there's this idea that Martin Luther King is a communist, and there's pictures of him on billboards. This is King in communist training school. He did attend lectures by leftist political thinkers. He was aware of leftist kind of economic philosophy. This was not new to him in 65, 68. So I think that had always been part of his understanding. But I think King was a very, very profoundly intelligent man. He understood the image that he had to present to the world. And one of the reasons, actually, you can say, why does he have such a powerful image as being the apostle of non-violence? Why does he have this image of being this Christian, safe man who America could respect, not fear? That's really important. He didn't want white Americans to fear him. He had to be middle class. He had to wear a suit. He had to look like white Americans look when they went to the church in their Sunday best. Because he believed at that time that America could be convinced to act, but you needed to have the support of the rest of the country and the federal government. And he didn't think he'd get the support of the rest of the country if he ran around criticising the nation. And obviously you're not going to get the support of the rest of the country if you run around talking about the innately racist structures of American capitalism, at least not in the 50s and early 60s. So he tailored his message, he cut his cloth, as it were, to suit that time, and was remarkably successful in what he did. But ultimately, I think the move to a more radical position is born out of frustration. It's born out of actually coming into contact, really for the first time, with the extent of black poverty in the urban ghetto. So he goes to Chicago and he sees 4 or 5 families living in one room in these kind of tenement buildings that would be condemned were white people living in them. And it had been declared in some cases unfit for human habitation half a century before. But the local authorities had done nothing to enforce housing codes or do anything about these kind of slumlords. Actually, there's an interesting look at Donald Trump there, because Donald Trump's father was a slumlord from New York, and he did exactly that. He had all these buildings in New York which had tremendous overcrowding, tremendous poverty, and almost exclusively African American residents. So King, in seeing this and actually realising just how bad the problems were in cities like Chicago, this does kind of push him to become, to kind of move away from the more, should we say, positive patriotic tone to one that's far more critical of the United States. Thanks.
Yeah, somewhat naive question, but in a way you paint a picture which is one of an almost intractable problem, and one which might lead us in a very sort of doom-laden mood. And integration as an issue in Britain, let alone in America, as we know, it's a highly controversial and almost negative issue these days because people are giving up on things.
Sure.
But if you had, and this may sound naive, but if you had had the ability to change the course of history in this hindsight, wonderful, how would you have, what policy steps, for example, would you have wanted to see that might have changed this, that might have really moved things forward, instead of this miasma of sort of inaction and hate and capture by the conservative elements in American society, which you described?
That's an excellent question. I suppose a hard one to answer because it depends. Are you saying in the 60s? Because I could go back a century before and change how the Civil War kind of ended in Reconstruction. I was talking to some of the students today, right? And Reconstruction, well, at the end of the Civil War, one of the biggest problems that why it must be considered a failure is that freed slaves aren't given any land, so they're never given a chance of economic independence, and so you're starting from a position of always being in poverty, or that's really the root cause of black poverty today in many ways. I gave you a stat about the value of the median value of the average white family's assets is 15 times higher than it is for African Americans, and that's because of property ownership. African Americans generally don't own their own properties, and that's because they've always lacked the capital and access to capital that whites have enjoyed. So those things, you know, if I was going back to pick one time, I'd say, well, let's have proper land reform in the South. Let's take it away from the slave masters, which never happened. Well, it was talked about, but it was decided that it would be too radical, that you would undermine people's work ethics if you just gave these ex-slaves land. So the land was left in the hands of people who owned it the whole time, and the former slaves became essentially serfs on southern land, and black poverty, as I say, has its roots there. But if you go to the 1960s, it's a tough one, because one of the fascinating things about studying American history, I think, especially in the 1960s, is race is obviously at the heart of it, but it's not just race as well, because when you get to 68, when Nixon's elected, you've got the dissolution of society with Vietnam. Liberalism has been blamed for all kinds of things, and it's not just African American rights, but it's a second wave feminism. You know, women and so on, they want to go out and have jobs and push back against male patriarchy. This is another problem in the eyes of many white Americans and many Americans in general. Gay rights is another issue. What's happened to society today? How can we be losing all these traditional values? And so civil rights gets bound up with, you know, encouraging lots of other people to resist traditional authority, to reject the Bible, and with the student anti-war protests, in many cases, white voters see their own children turning against them, turning against the flag, as it were, and so you get the rise of this kind of moralist Christian right in the late 60s and 70s, which says we're going to save the American flag, we're going to restore values. And in many ways, I think that's the most depressing turn, because it's from there that we've had. We talked about this at Cafe Scientifique the other night, I don't know if anyone was there, but you start getting, from this period onwards, especially in the 70s, people vote, a lot of American conservatives vote on issues like abortion or gay rights. And actually, they're voting against their economic interest. They're voting for a Republican Party that doesn't really care about the average working class or middle class American, but who's absolutely behind economic elites. But they have enough voters because they can press the hot button issues of abortion and gay rights and gay marriage and things like that, which really don't matter to the average person. You know, the evangelical Christian might rail against gay marriage, but if a gay person gets married, it doesn't affect them. You know, it might shatter their worldview and be appalling in their eyes, but it doesn't actually affect them yet. The things that do affect them, they'll happily vote for, even if it's negative, because they're willing to do it on the basis of social conservatism. So I think that's a really key shift in the late 60s. It becomes about morals rather than something else, I think, if I've made that fair enough.
Yeah, I have one question. Surely it's not only capital impoverishment, but in our own society, I think too, it was. How did you look at the number of, say, cases of people who were imprisoned or fined for libelous racial statements? I think in our own society here in Jersey, we also suffer from a certain racial problem, which could be corrected very easily by simply imprisoning or finding those people who could, and it's very difficult to prove, it could be done, because as soon as that happens, oh, I won't say that, I might be in prison. It's sort of like a parking fine. You actually don't do it. And that would, and society quickly accepts that. We have moved a tremendous amount of way in my own lifetime here. I know that because I worked in Africa, come back, and I could feel it. But still it is there. And it could be changed simply by these very simple acts.
I see what you're saying.
Smaller fines.
Yeah, but do you think? I think there's a difference though between. I mean, you're right, because it's now. You go back 50 years, or even probably 20 years. It's to be overtly racist. It's societally, it's a taboo, right? You know, if you heard someone using racial epithets in the street, and you're a decent, right-thinking person, then you would, that wouldn't seem right to you. That would seem unacceptable. But it's one thing to say those things out loud, and it's another to internalize ideas and values. So there's some great research in the United States. Now, again, I'll go back to an American example, but it's unconscious bias, you might call it, or it could be unconscious bias. So they've done tests where they send out CVs to employers across the United States, some with photos, some without photos, and roughly all the same, though. They've got the same kind of experiences. Now, if you have a picture, or no picture rather, if you just have the name John Adams, a CV, right? You couldn't guess what that person's race was. John Adams, you might assume they're white. Now, the test they've done, they then use African American names like Jamal or something like that, Sean, something unmistakably African American. The rates at which the African American ones are put to one side against the ones that are not obviously African American, is tremendous.
That's America, where it's deeply entrenched.
Yes.
Here we lead the way in terms of trying to change this sort of system. We can have a beneficial effect on America. Here, I think it would benefit from that too, wouldn't it? From some sort of making sure it wasn't below the surface.
I think anything that forces people to think about what they're saying, and there's some kind of consequence for being racist, because of course often there is no consequence.
That's the problem.
You can only feel public shame if you have the capacity to feel shame, and I think often people don't in the case of something like that. But no, I mean, if it's something that would actually, and you could raise some extra money as well, right? So you're not necessarily the worst thing in the world. But I think that would help to a degree, but there are other dimensions to racism that are harder to legislate against. I mean, how do you really convince people to change their minds about something? Only that person ever knows if they actually have. But yeah, I want to be positive and upbeat. So I do think we are moving in the right direction in this country, but we think we still have a long way to go as well.
Thanks for that, Tom.
That's right.
It seems to me like it's almost hard to move away from the convincingness of a Marxist argument that as long as capitalism is so pervasive in US society, the gap between the wealthy and poor growing continuously. It's almost, to address racial equality is going to be, now impossible as long as the socioeconomic inequality is growing. It's always symbiotic, which one's causing which. The reality is probably they're both sort of having a negative impact on each other. So that sounds very much in the doom and gloom.
Sure.
Because we know capitalism is so entrenched in America. How can we realistically expect racial equality to improve without a look at the capitalist model that's being used?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm not sure I have a particularly positive answer for you. But I think ultimately you're right to say I mean, ultimately, at heart, one of the kind of key issues I kind of loosely mentioned about American politics is the extent to which an attempt to address economic inequality is always understood as an attempt to address racial equality. And this is, again, why Obamacare has had such pushback. Because there are Obamacare states in America, places like Kentucky, whereas if you get, when you tell white voters what Obamacare is doing, they say, well, that sounds fantastic. And you call it Obamacare, and then they're dead against it. And that's because there's a racial politics to economic inequality that says, which is exactly why you have whites voting against their own economic interests, because they think, in many cases, that African Americans are being helped by these policies. And actually, the history of public policy in the United States has been that really only whites have benefited from public policy. And that actually, much public policy has only reinforced white privilege and made inequality along racial lines much worse. So, how do I think there'll be change? I think you need to have a truly interracial movement that incorporates much of the American working class, purely because without broad consensus and incorporation across a very large group that isn't just focused on black issues. And this is one of the shades of Black Lives Matter. It's a really interesting movement, but I fear that it's always going to be limited if they're calling themselves Black Lives Matter, because other people have already and will continue to say, well, what about Latino lives? What about white lives? Don't they matter? And that's exactly the kind of thing that's already being said to these activists. So I think if there is to be real change, there needs to be a real kind of interracial movement of not just poor, but actually working lower middle class people as well. But of course, that's the holy grail of politics. Can you ever get the middle class to actually align with working class rather than seeing themselves as being somewhere higher up, or at least headed for somewhere higher up. So I think all things are possible. We didn't think Donald Trump would be on the ticket for 2016, and yet here we are, although that's the opposite of what we want. Perhaps, Bernie Sanders' campaign has been very interesting. It shows there is a lot of grassroots support for social and economic justice policies. Maybe that could be some kind of springboard for a broader kind of organising effort across the United States. I don't know. We can but hope.
So are you a fan of positive discrimination? Do you believe
Do I do affirmative action busing?
Yeah.
Am I a fan? Yeah, I think I am, because of course you're always going to have those people who are not being positively discriminated against are going to feel like it's an injustice. As I said, they feel, why is this person being bettered at my expense? Why are they being guaranteed opportunity that I can't have because I'm not the right colour? But unless you take positive steps to do something about historical injustice, they will always remain. You're always going to have that lag or gap between the idea of equality and the fact of equality, unless you take some kind of affirmative action to correct it. So, of course, it's easy for me to say. I'm not the one who has to necessarily miss out on an opportunity, but I think, at least that's my philosophy. We're never going to combat racial inequality, gender inequality in the workplace unless these things are confronted, unless an effort is made to increase the numbers of minorities in certain jobs or women in certain jobs. You can't talk about it forever. There has to be some kind of action.
But I thought when I asked you that question about levers, political and social levers, I thought you might refer to education. Because in a sense, you've got to play this out in terms of, as you said, the American master narrative, which is economic and social ability will come to those who work hard enough. And do you think, for example, there should be, and I don't want to be an apologist for the academy system, but this notion that you, in a sense, you put kids in separate schools, in a hothouse atmosphere almost, and you say, we're going to focus on you, we're going to really drive you, and not only that, but we're going to make sure you get to the best, or we're going to help you get to the best universities, for example, even though it may look unequal to people, it may look socially divisive, blah, blah, blah. Do you think that if education had been used as an instrument, we'd be far farther ahead?
Well, I think to an extent it was, right? So affirmative action, where it wasn't happening in the workplace, it was university programs. But the problem was that the people who got onto this programs were the socially mobile African Americans who were ready to take those chances. And I think ultimately it's a great point about education, because if we're going to deal with any of the problems that we have in society here or in America, it's going to come with education. It's going to come with having a more socially enlightened or progressive mindset in the future generations, and that has to come from the classroom, I think, because I'm not sure where else it would come from. But so in the US, affirmative action university system helped a lot of African Americans, but they weren't really the ones who needed help. They were already the pretty smart ones, are the ones who were already middle class or maybe even pseudo-elite. So it's helped people like, to return to the earliest question about the value of having a black president, well, it's a bit similar. You know, it's great to have African Americans in college, but it doesn't really change broader inequality. If all you really have is a kind of ugly, mobile black middle class become part of American financial, political, economic elite because they get opportunities, but you still have the vast majority of African Americans be poor and be denied those opportunities, you haven't really changed anything. You just put a few black faces in political office and
Yeah, it kind of underlines your point, doesn't it, that they've made it. If these other people haven't, it's their own fault.
Exactly.
So let's not worry about
well, this is it. And
litigation.
no, that's absolutely right. It's a post-racial society. Obama is conservatives love Obama for this, because they can point to Obama and say, how can there be racism in this country? We have a black president. And that's exactly what it said. Dinesh D'Souza used those very words. It's the idea that, well, look, anyone who tells you there's institutional racism can go to hell because we've got an African American president. And that couldn't happen if we were a racist country, which is nonsense, of course. But it's people look at it and think, yeah, well, how can it be a racist country? We have a black president. And that's a very powerful argument, because it rests on that history that I've told you about. It rests on the idea that what the civil rights movement was. And one thing about having a mass narrative is also, you draw two dates in it, you say, well, it finished. It started here and it finished there. And that's a long time ago. And what we're really saying, the civil rights movement and the battle for racial equality never finished. It's still ongoing, and we can look at what's happening in America right now to see that clearly enough. It may have been pushed off the agenda and forgotten about and ignored, but inequality never went away. Injustice never went away. Yes, the movement changed, it wasn't working the same way, and maybe what we have now, this kind of rebirth of that kind of pseudo-civil rights movement is really interesting. But having a narrative that says we can draw a line here, and we can draw a line, King essentially, he dies a few years later, and often his death is seen as kind of symbolic of the death of the civil rights movement. So it's in the past, it's something that ended, we dealt with it, it's no longer a problem. I don't need to tell you what to think about America, but it seems pretty obvious to me that racism and inequality is here to stay for, I think, at least another generation or two, but who knows?
Okay, I think I'll call it there. Thank you very much, Tom.
Thank you.
Tom,